If you were born in Britain in the year 2000, your parents' generation earned, on average, roughly the same real wage you do today. Not similar, the same. Adjusted for inflation, the typical British worker's pay packet has barely moved since before the global financial crisis. This is not a recession. A recession ends. This is something stranger. A nearly 2-decade stall in the fortunes of one of the world's oldest industrial economies. Economists have a term for it. They call it the productivity puzzle. But the people living through it have a simpler name: the lost decades. Today, we trace how the sixth largest economy on Earth quietly stopped growing, and why, despite promise after promise from Westminster, it still hasn't started again. To understand how unusual Britain's situation is, you have to understand what growth actually means to an economy. Gross domestic product per head is, in essence, the size of the economic pie divided among everyone living in the country. When that pie grows faster than the population, living standards rise. When it doesn't, they don't. For most of the 20th century, Britain's economy grew at a fairly reliable pace, roughly 2% a year, doubling living standards every generation. Then came 2008. Since the financial crisis, UK productivity growth, the amount of output produced per hour worked, which is the true engine of rising wages, has collapsed to less than a third of its pre-crisis pace. Real wages today sit at almost exactly the level they were at in 2005. On some measures, this is the longest pay stagnation Britain has recorded in over 200 years. This is the foundation everything else in this story rests on. Not a crash, a flat line. Every investigation needs a starting point, and for the UK economy, it is unambiguous: the global financial crisis. Britain went into 2008 with an economy unusually dependent on one sector: finance. London wasn't just a financial center. It was, by some measures, the financial center of the world. That made the crash of the banking system less like a normal recession and more like an amputation. When credit froze and banks collapsed, Britain lost a disproportionate share of the exact industry it had built its modern prosperity on. Every advanced economy suffered in 2008, but most bounced back within a few years, resuming something like their old trajectory. Britain didn't. Investment, both public and private, never fully recovered. And a decade of government austerity, deliberately cutting public spending to bring down the deficit, removed exactly the kind of public investment in infrastructure, in skills, in research that could have cushioned the blow and rebuilt momentum. The result was a vicious cycle. Low investment led to low productivity led to low growth, and low growth gave governments even less room to invest. If 2008 was the wound, 2016 is where the story turns political. The vote to leave the European Union didn't crash the economy overnight. Its effect has been slower and in some ways harder to see, which is exactly why it remains one of the most contested numbers in British economics. The government's own independent forecaster, the Office for Budget Responsibility, has maintained for years that Brexit will ultimately reduce the UK's long-run productivity by around 4%, driven by a roughly 15% fall in trade with the EU compared to had Britain stayed. Academic researchers using nearly a decade of post-referendum data have gone further, estimating the hit to GDP per capita at closer to 6 to 8%, with investment down by more than a tenth. Not every economist agrees on the size of the number. Some argue trade volumes have held up better than predicted, and that the effect is smaller and slower than official forecasts suggest. But almost none dispute the direction. New barriers to trading with Britain's largest and closest market made the economy less efficient, discouraged investment, and arrived at the worst possible moment, just as the country was still nursing the wounds of 2008. Here is what makes the UK's stagnation genuinely strange, even to economists who study it for a living. Employment has not collapsed. In fact, for much of this period, more Britons have been in work than ever before. Normally, more people working means a bigger economy. But if each of those workers is producing roughly the same amount as they did 15 years ago, no faster, no more efficiently, then adding jobs doesn't create the kind of growth that raises everyone's living standards. It just spreads the same sized pie across more plates. Britain has one of the lowest levels of business investment in the G7, a group of the world's largest advanced economies, and has held that position for nearly every year since 1990. Research and development spending lags well behind international peers. Robot and automation adoption in British factories ranks near the bottom of major economies. And the regional picture is worse still. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham remain roughly a third less productive than London, a gap far wider than comparable second cities in France or Germany. Put simply, Britain kept adding workers to the same machines, doing the same jobs, without upgrading the machines. And when productivity doesn't grow, wages can't either. Just as the economy might have begun clawing back ground, it was hit again and again. The COVID-19 pandemic delivered the sharpest quarterly economic contraction on record. Then, as the world was still recovering, Russia's invasion of Ukraine sent energy prices spiraling, and Britain, with among the highest electricity costs of any advanced economy, was hit harder than most. A chaotic mini-budget in September 2022 briefly sent borrowing costs and mortgage rates soaring, rattling business confidence for years afterward. Layered on top of all this is a slower-moving crisis, a sharp rise in long-term sickness pulling hundreds of thousands of working-age adults, many of them older and highly experienced, out of the labor force altogether, a trend the Bank of England has openly said it does not expect to reverse. Individually, any one of these shocks might have been absorbed by a healthy economy. Stacked one on top of another, onto a foundation already weakened since 2008 and structurally altered by Brexit, they turned a slowdown into something that increasingly looks like the new normal. As of 2026, the picture remains, by the government's own admission, unspectacular. GDP growth has hovered barely above zero in recent quarters. Inflation has stayed stubbornly above target. Real wages, adjusted for the cost of living, are only marginally higher than they were roughly 2 decades ago. The current government has made economic growth its central promise, and officials continue to insist the foundations for a recovery are being laid. Independent forecasters are more cautious, describing a narrow path between reviving investment, absorbing an aging and shrinking workforce, and avoiding yet another external shock. What is rarely said out loud in Westminster is the scale of what recovery would actually require. Reversing 20 years of lost productivity growth isn't a single policy. It is a decade-long rebuilding project, of infrastructure, of trade relationships, of a workforce battered by ill health, and of an investment culture that has, for a generation, chosen caution over ambition. Britain is not a poor country. It remains one of the largest economies on the planet, home to world-class universities, a globally significant financial sector, and industries still admired abroad. What it has lost is not wealth, it is momentum. And momentum, once lost across nearly 2 decades, is far harder to rebuild than any single crisis, any single referendum, any single decision at the ballot box. The question facing Britain now isn't whether the last 20 years went wrong. Almost everyone, across the political spectrum, agrees that they did. The real question, the one no government has yet answered, is whether the next 20 will look any different.